Russia said we're building a buffer zone that Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkov that protect the territories of Russia, Belgorod, Kursk, and Orel, I believe, from Ukrainian attack. Having said this, because Russia's hinted at this in the past, this will happen. And that's a bad news for American negotiators, because this just throws in another layer of complexity. Because now, in addition to getting Ukraine to withdraw from 4 territories, Ukraine will have to cede a probably 150-kilometer buffer zone where it will not be allowed to have any military resources at all. This will happen. I'm just telling you right now that once Russia commits to something, they don't come back. The time to avoid that was the last round of negotiations. Ukraine didn't. They escalated the issue. They launched attacks. And now Russia is making advances.
What if I told you the Ukrainian front line is crumbling, not just slowly, but in catastrophic silence, and no one in the West dares to admit it? What if the real game changer isn't some billion-dollar weapons package from Washington, but the quiet, relentless advance of Russian forces in Sumy Donetsk and Zaporizhia? While Western media drowns itself in moral platitudes, drones and artillery are redrawing the map of eastern Ukraine by the hour, the so-called fortified lines of Kyiv are turning into historical footnotes. As the conflict deepens, the fog of war is clearing for those who dare to look. This video will take you across every key axis of the battlefield, from Sumy to Lyman to Pokrovsk, and by the end, one thing will be clear: the Western-backed Ukrainian project is imploding from within. So stay with us until the end, and as always, leave your thoughts below. We want to hear what you see happening behind the headlines. And yes, we'll hear from Scott Ritter too. You don't want to miss it. The Sumy axis in northern Ukraine is no longer a tension point. It is a pressure cooker with the lid about to explode. Russian forces have moved well beyond the probing stage. They are pushing forward with deliberate intent. The town of Yunakovka is now halfway under Russian control, while the nearby village of Mala Korchakivka remains a fiercely contested zone. Meanwhile, geolocation imagery has confirmed Russian presence near Myropilya, right on the verge of breaking through entirely. The once linear front line has dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance. Ukrainian positions are not just retreating, they are unraveling. According to multiple battlefield monitors, the Russian military is positioning itself within effective drone and artillery range of Sumy city. But make no mistake, this is not about capturing urban centers. It's about rendering them useless. Every command, post, fuel, depot, or transport hub within this range is now under constant threat of aerial attack. Convoys attempting to move through the area risk being reduced to smoking wreckage. Sumy itself has effectively become a drone no-go zone. Ukrainian officials reportedly cannot conduct basic operations without the fear of sudden UAV strikes. The mechanical hum of loitering munitions now replaces the natural soundscape of the city. It is not warfare in the traditional sense, it is a psychological siege conducted by machines. This is how modern war looks: no declaration, no warning, just the eerie buzz before an explosion. And in this case, Russia isn't interested in flashy headlines. It is focused on systematically neutralizing Ukraine's logistical depth. Even Western analysts are beginning to acknowledge the cracks. The defensive network around Sumy, long considered a buffer against northern thrusts, is collapsing in slow motion. The longer the Ukrainian military delays a strategic repositioning, the more likely we will see not a retreat, but a rout. And amid all this, the real irony is that the West continues to speak of Ukrainian resilience, while actual footage shows abandoned trenches, burnt-out vehicles, and overstretched defenders caught between too many fronts. But while northern Ukraine is disintegrating under relentless pressure, the southern front reveals a different strategy, one that cuts through the fields like a blade through silk. In the southern region of Donetsk, the Russian advance has moved past the line of contact and into strategic realignment. What's unfolding here is not chaos, it's choreography. The Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed that Malinovka, a key settlement in the south, is now under full control of Russian forces. Around Alexievka, additional trench lines have been captured. The direction of movement is unmistakable towards Zaporizhia. Unlike the war of attrition seen elsewhere, the southern offensive carries surgical precision. What Western observers still naively label as tactical adjustments are, in reality, the gradual reshaping of entire front lines. It is reminiscent of a chess match where the opponent thinks they are playing checkers. The situation around Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk is approaching critical mass. Russian forces have not physically encircled the cities, but they don't have to. With UAVs now hovering constantly and drone-assisted artillery picking off vehicles, Ukrainian logistics have transformed into what can only be described as a gamble. Every resupply convoy heading toward the front risks destruction. The roads that were once arteries for movement are now corridors of doom. One stretch near Pokrovsk has become so dangerous that destroyed vehicles litter the terrain, resembling the infamous Road of Death witnessed in Kursk weeks ago. Images show scorched support trucks, melted metal frames, and combat units fleeing under fire. There are no illusions here. Ukraine is bleeding and it knows it. And what of Kyiv's response? Symbolism, holding towns for morale while the flanks are collapsing. Ukrainian media platforms are busy spinning minor counterattacks into breakthroughs, while the Russian side continues building layered defenses and capturing territory. The disparity between field reality and information warfare has never been clearer. As Scott Ritter noted, you don't fight reality, you accept it and adapt. Otherwise, reality breaks you. And Ukraine, under its current doctrine, seems to be headed straight into the latter. The most telling sign, no mention of Russian advances in key Western briefings. When silence replaces spin, something has truly gone wrong. Still, the Southern strategy is not an isolated case. It is part of a wider matrix of maneuvers stretching from Kharkov to Lyman, designed to overload Ukrainian defenses from every angle. In the northeastern quadrant, the battle for Liman and the Kharkov region is morphing into a slow but inevitable encirclement. Russian forces, primarily from the Zapad operational group, have intensified their push through Redkodub and deeper into Ukraine's logistical arteries. One of the most significant developments is the approach toward Novi Mir. This area isn't just symbolic, it's central to regional resupply lines. And just south of it, the town of Krasnoyarsk has already been seized by Russian units. That's less than 1 kilometer from critical Ukrainian assets. In Grakovka, resistance is fierce, but becoming futile. Moscow's troops are not focused on rushing the village. They are moving to surround it from two sides, northeast and southwest, creating what can only be described as a slow-pressure trap. Once closed, these traps are hard to break without major losses. Further south, Zelenaya Dolina has become a microcosm of Russia's wider doctrines: surround, isolate pressure. Reports confirm that half of the settlement is now under Russian control. Ukrainian forces are attempting counterattacks from Chandrigalovo, but even these efforts are failing to reverse momentum. West of Redkodub, Ukraine is desperately trying to hold the line across the Netrus River near Karpovka, but Moscow isn't wasting manpower on direct assaults. It's using artillery and UAVs to choke off movements and drain ammunition stockpiles. It's an attritional strategy, and it's working. In Torko, an area previously under Ukrainian control, Russian advances are being reported from 3 separate directions. Ukrainian command has admitted that its hold there is temporary and dynamic, a euphemism for chaos. The most dangerous aspect of all this is not the speed of Russian movement, but its deliberate nature. There's no rush, just steady progress. And that consistency is far more lethal than a quick blitz. And while all eyes are on the front lines, a quieter, more strategic war is being waged in the shadows, targeting infrastructure, fuel, and command cohesion. While battles rage on the front lines, Ukraine's most dangerous collapse might be happening far from the trenches. It's in the meeting rooms, in the command centers, and in the backrooms of power in Kyiv. The internal structure is weakening, strained by a war it cannot win, and a public increasingly aware of the futility. The shortages in manpower are no longer a rumor, they are a reality. More units are stretched thin, undertrained, and overdeployed. Casualty reports are kept vague, but the signs are everywhere. Every kilometer Russia gains comes with mounting losses for the armed forces of Ukraine, and these aren't just foot soldiers. They're the core of what remains of the country's fighting strength. President Zelensky now finds himself not only fighting Russia, but also battling political irrelevance. His biggest concern today is not a breakthrough at the front, it's the conflict between Iran and Israel. Why? Because if oil prices spike, Moscow gains billions in unexpected revenue. And if Tel Aviv demands more attention from the West, Washington and its allies will inevitably divert resources, media focus, and political capital away from Ukraine. The West is running out of patience and worse, out of weapons. And Kyiv is running out of time. What once looked like a global moral crusade is now seen for what it is, a prolonged drain on the economies and arsenals of Europe and North America with little to show in return. Take Pokrovsk, for instance. On that single axis, the Ukrainian General Staff reports 39 Russian assault attempts in just one day, Saturday the 15th of June. Ukrainian officials claim to have inflicted 136 Russian casualties, including 84 dead. But such numbers, even if true, don't change the fact that Moscow is still attacking again and again. What does that tell us? It tells us the Russians can absorb losses and still push forward, while Ukraine bleeds for every inch it holds. Across Donetsk, near Burlatskoye and Novopol, Russian advances continue. The slow grind has become the strategy. There are no grand encirclements, yet no lightning-fast operations. But the goal isn't shock, it's erosion. And every new trench the Russians dig, every drone strike they conduct, eats away at Ukrainian defense and morale. And still, Western leaders speak of a spring counteroffensive that never came. They praise Ukrainian bravery while quietly slashing weapons deliveries. Politicians smile for the cameras, while in backrooms they question how much longer this war can be maintained. There is no miracle weapon on the way. There is no sudden turn of fortune. There is only manpower running out, ammunition running low, and a nation collapsing under the weight of Western promises. Which brings us to a sobering truth, one not broadcast on news networks, but written clearly in smoke and silence across the landscape of eastern Ukraine. After more than 2 years of grinding warfare, what remains in Ukraine is not a story of liberation or victory. It is a slow-motion collapse disguised as resistance. Russian forces are not storming Kyiv. They don't need to. Instead, they are dismantling Ukraine in pieces, sector by sector, depot by depot, soldier by soldier. It is not a campaign of conquest. It is a campaign of exhaustion, and it is working. Across Sumy, Donetsk, Kharkov, and Zaporizhia, a consistent picture emerges. Ukraine is being bled dry militarily, economically, and politically. The West's talking points of bravery and resilience have become hollow, repeated by officials who no longer believe them but cannot afford to admit defeat. Meanwhile, in Russia, the mood is not euphoric but steady. There is no need for celebration, only continuation. That is the essence of endurance. Behind the front lines, what was once a vibrant civil society in Ukraine is now overshadowed by martial law, conscription patrols, and dwindling trust. Ukrainian citizens are not rallying, they are fleeing, hiding, or simply bracing for what comes next. There is no plan B. There's only prolongation. In the West, public support is cracking. In Berlin, Paris, and Washington, the question is no longer how do we help Ukraine win, but rather how do we exit without embarrassment. And the truth is, they can't. Not when their policies have created a dependency they now wish to walk away from. As Scott Ritter warned with chilling clarity, wars aren't won by slogans. They're won by men willing to bleed and nations willing to wait. Russia is bleeding, but it is also waiting, and in silence, it is winning. For Ukraine, this war has become a struggle not for victory, but for survival with dignity. For the West, it is a test of patience and narrative control. But for Russia, it is a mission of attrition, and the strategy is succeeding. Comment below, do you still see a path to victory, or is this war revealing truths the media refuses to acknowledge?
This isn't the old drone. These are modern drones coming in, and they're devastating, and nothing can stop them. Ukraine has run out. They have no more Italian missiles, no more French missiles. The Patriots are depleted. They've got nothing. And this is because of a strategic air campaign planned by Russia to overwhelm the most concentrated air defense network in the world, which NATO put in place in Ukraine and now has been effectively destroyed. Russia has said that the 4 territories that it acquired are constitutionally Russian. The bad news for Ukraine and the West is that Russia won't stop this war. The even worse news is that Russia put Ukraine on notice. This is Ukraine's last chance. Accept peace or 4 more. And Medinsky isn't lying. The Russians don't lie. They're slow to harness. But once they make that decision, quick to run. In addition to that, Russia said that we're building a buffer zone.
In the smoldering chessboard of Eastern Europe, a dramatic escalation unfolds. And no, it's not front page in the Western press. While global headlines obsess over Middle Eastern theatrics, Russia is unleashing one of its largest and most coordinated strikes yet against Ukraine. Think 500 UAVs, hypersonic missiles, and the entrance of the Tuesday 160, the White Swan, for its first ever combat role in Ukraine. Meanwhile, cracks are forming in the Western alliance. The U.S. quietly plans to reduce weapons aid. Sanctions once touted as silver bullets are backfiring. And former President Trump just admitted publicly that the West's economic sword has dulled. Is Washington losing its grip? What's really happening in Ukraine? Why did Russia escalate now? And why is the U.S. stepping back when it should be doubling down? Stay with us to the end as we unpack the shifting balance of power, reveal Washington's miscalculations, and confront the uncomfortable question, has the unipolar moment finally expired? Even Scott Ritter has warned, you can't bluff with a busted flush. We'll come back to him. And don't forget, drop your thoughts in the comments below. On Tuesday, the 17th of June, Russia launched what many analysts are now calling the most complex and synchronized strike operation since the beginning of the conflict. Early in the morning, waves of unmanned aerial vehicles swept across the Ukrainian sky in a formation designed to overwhelm. It wasn't just 1 or 2 clusters of drones. There were reports of 3 distinct waves. Some sources stated around 150 UAVs, but others claimed the number exceeded 500. Regardless of the exact count, the visual impact was unmistakable. Ukrainian skies filled with moving shadows, alarms, screaming air defenses, stretched thin. But this wasn't just a drone show. Russia integrated a variety of assets into this operation. The Su-57, a stealth multi-role fighter, entered the airspace. The MiG-31 launched with Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. And for the first time in the war, the Tuesday 160 bomber, the so-called White Swan, took to the air for combat purposes. The sheer presence of this aircraft was a statement. Measuring 54 meters in length and capable of supersonic speeds, it released 36 Kh-101 cruise missiles in a coordinated barrage aimed at targets across Ukraine. This was not only an act of force, it was also a display of reach, coordination, and psychological pressure. This bomber's role in the Russian nuclear triad makes it more than just an offensive tool. It is a symbol of strategic intent. With a range over 12,000 kilometers and payload capacity that rivals any aircraft in the world, it can strike targets far beyond Ukraine. Though it carried conventional weapons in this operation, the Tuesday 160 is also capable of deploying nuclear-capable cruise missiles, including the Kh-102 variant. And this shift from strategic reserve to active engagement is what concerns many military observers most. As explosions rang out in Kyiv, Rivne, and Odessa, Ukrainian air defense systems scrambled to respond. But the Russians didn't just rely on brute force. They used bait decoy projectiles and flares, confusing radar systems and triggering interceptor launches on harmless objects. In doing so, they created vulnerabilities, allowing real missiles to slip through. Footage from civilians showed sudden bursts of light shockwaves that rattled buildings and smoke clouds in the shape of mushrooms rising from industrial zones. This attack was not a random escalation. It was timed, structured, and layered, and it reminded the world that Russia, far from being exhausted, still has cards to play, and very heavy ones. And as Russia demonstrated its long-range hand, the response from the West was not escalation, but hesitation. While missile trails scorched the Ukrainian skies, political winds in the West were shifting quietly but unmistakably. In upcoming fiscal year budget discussions for 2026, former military officer and media personality Pete Hegseth surprised observers with a blunt assessment. Continuing weapons aid to Ukraine may not be the most practical path forward. He suggested that pursuing peace, even if imperfect, could serve both sides better than feeding an endless war. The tone was not one of defeat, but of calculation. A subtle retreat cloaked in fiscal responsibility. Meanwhile, at the latest G7 summit, President Biden delivered a moment of rare candor. Speaking about sanctions, he admitted that times had changed. "We used to make billions from sanctions," he said. "Now we lose billions." That one sentence said more than any press release. It confirmed what many already suspected, that the tools once used to pressure adversaries are now hurting the West economically. Sanctions no longer generate leverage. Instead, they drain resources and breed global fatigue. Donald Trump added his own voice to the mix, accusing past administrations of strategic failure. At a recent public appearance, he stated that removing Russia from the G8 was a major mistake. He argued that if Russia had remained in the fold, the conflict might have been avoided altogether. He blamed Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau for pushing Moscow out, isolating a power that should have been negotiated with, not shunned. While the timeline is debatable, the criticism resonated. It reflected a deeper Western unease that past strategies may have backfired. Across European capitals, signs of war fatigue are becoming harder to hide. Inflation driven by energy shortages, public protests, and declining approval ratings are combining into a geopolitical hangover. In Berlin, Paris, and Rome, voters are asking whether their sacrifices have yielded any measurable success. Meanwhile, Russia has adapted, rerouting trade through Asia, increasing ties with BRICS nations, and proving that sanctions are not a death sentence, but a challenge to innovate. Weapons stockpiles are depleting. Manufacturing cannot keep pace. And each month, the voices questioning the logic of continued involvement grow louder. What was once framed as a united stand against aggression is now sounding more like an expensive stalemate. And when even American defense planners start speaking of limits, the message is clear: the will to sustain this conflict is weakening. And in that quiet unraveling of confidence, Russia is not just listening, it is advancing. Diplomacy used to be the tool of last resort, a buffer, a valve to release pressure before it erupted. But now even that tool seems broken. In mid-June, the Russian Foreign Ministry revealed that scheduled talks between Moscow and Washington designed to ease tensions and address bilateral issues were abruptly canceled by the American side. The official excuse that Russia was delaying or not negotiating in good faith. But the reality may be more uncomfortable. Perhaps it was not about delays, but about timing. Because this happened just as Russia was launching one of its largest aerial operations of the conflict, with strategic bombers in the sky and cruise missiles in motion. In other words, diplomacy didn't die in silence, it was drowned out by jet engines and geopolitical anxiety. The cost of dialogue is minimal. A table, a translator, maybe some bottled water and hotel coffee. Yet even that has become too costly for an administration that seems more invested in narrative control than resolution. When a global superpower cancels talks, not for tactical reasons, but because the optics are bad, it says a lot. It says diplomacy is no longer a goal, but a performance. And performances only continue when they please the audience. Right now, that audience, be it voters, media, or contractors, has grown used to conflict, not compromise. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. While Russia demonstrated capability and reach Western diplomatic channels remained idle, there was no rebuttal, no counteroffer, not even a symbolic gesture. The silence itself was loud. In fact, some observers argued that this refusal to engage diplomatically mirrored the larger Western pattern: avoid meaningful dialogue, blame. The other side then doubled down on talking points rather than talks. And as one commentator dryly noted, when you can't win the war or win the peace, you avoid both. This isn't the first time dialogue has failed, but it might be the most consequential, because in today's geopolitical landscape, missed meetings have cascading effects. Inaction becomes interpretation. And right now, that interpretation is grim, that Washington no longer seeks a settlement, only stalemate, and that it no longer views diplomacy as leverage, but as liability. In the past, even during the Cold War's tensest moments, there was always a hotline, a channel, a forum. Today, with tensions rising and new powers entering the equation, the absence of diplomacy is itself provocative. And it's not Russia closing the door this time, it's the West walking away from the table it once built. And while the chairs at the negotiation table sat empty, another voice roared above Ukraine, traveling faster than sound and louder than any silence. This new phase of Russia's campaign is not just military. It is rhetorical, spoken in the language of shock and scale. The Tuesday 160 bomber released from its strategic cage delivered a clear and sobering statement. Russia's arsenal, once assumed to be kept in reserve, is now active. 36 Kh-101 cruise missiles were launched in a single coordinated wave, each missile equipped with GPS and terrain-matching navigation, each missile capable of reaching over 4,500 kilometers. These weren't random targets. They were carefully chosen not only for tactical value, but for symbolic weight. What made this even more striking was what lay in the shadow of those missiles, the Kh-102, identical in structure but nuclear capable. They weren't used this time, but their potential was hanging in the air. This wasn't nuclear blackmail. It was strategic demonstration. Russia was showing that it has precision discipline and the capability to scale its power projection at will, and it did so with chilling elegance. What makes this moment more consequential is how it redefines the idea of deterrence. The message wasn't just for Ukraine. It was for Europe, for NATO, for the world's military planners who believed Moscow was running out of options. Far from it. Russia was demonstrating that it could strike not only tactically but psychologically. The skies over Kyiv, and by implication the skies over Warsaw, Berlin, and perhaps beyond, are within reach. The silence that followed the missile strikes wasn't just physical, it was strategic. Because there was no response, no new sanctions, no counterstrikes, just silence. And that silence is dangerous. It reinforces Moscow's sense that the West has no answer, no coherent plan, beyond temporary gestures. What we witnessed wasn't just an airstrike, it was a signal that Russia has entered a different stage of warfare, one where strategic weapons are integrated into conventional conflict. That is a threshold moment. And the West, for now, is still treating it like a routine bulletin. As former intelligence officer Scott Ritter once said, Russia doesn't need to win quickly. It just needs to not lose. Time is a weapon too. That quote now echoes more loudly than ever. Because what Russia has gained is not just territory or headlines, it's time to refine, to adapt, and to outlast. And that perhaps is the true battlefield. While think tanks debate semantics and analysts argue over ratios, Moscow is playing a different game. It's not just defending ground, it's building pressure, demonstrating that it can escalate without overcommitting, that it can fight without fatigue, and that it can signal without bluffing. And as the echoes of those missiles fade, we're left with one unsettling question. If the West refuses to fight and refuses to talk, what options remain? There was a time when sanctions were considered the crown jewel of Western power projection. No boots on the ground, no blood spilled, just banking restrictions, export bans, and frozen accounts. Clean controlled, and in theory crippling, but that illusion is fading fast. In the case of Russia, sanctions haven't stopped the war, they've only reshaped it. Moscow has not collapsed. Instead, it has adapted. Oil is still flowing, not westward but eastward. Trade with BRICS nations is not slowing, it's accelerating. And the ruble stabilized, if not stronger than expected. The economic storm that was meant to ground the Russian machine has instead blown across Europe, leaving inflation, energy shortages, and political instability in its wake. Washington's last real card economic warfare has been played, and now it's curling at the edges. In Germany and France, energy bills have tripled since early 2022. Public protests have broken out in major cities. The middle class feels squeezed not by Moscow's actions, but by their own government's reactions. Meanwhile, Russia's energy sector remains intact. It has simply rerouted its exports toward China, India, and the Middle East. New pipelines are being discussed. Payment systems are shifting from SWIFT to local alternatives. The world is watching, and many are taking notes. In this new environment, Iran and China emerge not as bystanders, but as strategic observers. They see a West struggling to enforce its economic edicts, while the East adapts, endures, and in some cases thrives. These are not formal alliances, but functional alignments. What Russia has shown is that if isolated, a nation can still pivot, and in pivoting can challenge the entire architecture of Western dominance. The message to the global South is simple: the age of unilateral sanctions is over. You don't have to be rich to resist, you just have to be resilient. Militarily, Russia is also rewriting the playbook. Gone is the image of a lumbering conventional army. What we see now is experimentation in real time, mass UAV deployment, hypersonic missile integration, strategic bombers used in precision strikes. This is no longer a traditional war. It is a technological rehearsal for future conflicts. Russia isn't just adapting, it's innovating. And the West, it's reacting, always one step behind, always trying to catch up to a doctrine it doesn't fully understand. As Western policymakers hold press briefings and announce another round of restrictions, Russia answers with silence and with Tuesday 160 bombers, with GPS-guided missiles, with weaponized patience. What's left unspoken is what now lingers. Loudest sanctions don't break steel, and press conferences don't stop hypersonics. When diplomacy stalls and economic tools collapse under their own weight, the battlefield becomes the only language spoken. And in that language, Russia is no longer asking questions, it is writing the grammar. So what now, America? When every tool fails and every bet misfires, what's left to play, Russia is no longer reacting, it is setting the pace. Ukraine is no longer the centerpiece, it's the canvas. The West too divided to lead, too proud to follow, and too exhausted to persist. And now, as the Tuesday 160 cruises high above the storm, the question is no longer how to stop the war, but whether the West can even find its way out. Scott Ritter warned us early on, you can't deter what you don't understand. Maybe it's time Washington starts listening, not to itself, but to the world. It's losing. Drop your thoughts below. Has the era of Western dominance quietly expired, or is there one last card left to play?
Vladimir Putin knows the United States of America better than Donald Trump does. And Vladimir Putin knows Russia 400 times better than, which means that Vladimir Putin is very much in control of the situation. I gave Donald Trump 100 days. I held my tongue. I said, he's the president of the United States. I wish him well. He has vision. He wants to implement this vision, including Russia. Now's the time to speak honestly. Donald Trump is the most incompetent man to rule the White House. Scott Bessent, who continues to believe somehow that we can strangle Russia economically, although I challenge Bessent to point Russia out on a map, let alone Russia's oil fields, and to discuss the complexity of how Russia generates oil-derived income, the various methodologies used to get that oil to market, and why you'll never strangle Russia, even if you seek to impose 500% tariffs on those nations.
What happens when a superpower plays chess while its enemies throw punches, when diplomacy is met with drone strikes and restraint is misread as weakness? Over the past year, Russia has repeatedly shown goodwill before peace talks halting, strikes stepping back, signaling readiness, but the West, it punches first, negotiates later. From Istanbul in 2022 to the ceasefire window of April 2025, Moscow kept signaling de-escalation. The result? More UAVs over Belgorod, more saboteurs inside Russian borders, and yet another strategic pause exploited by the other side. But this isn't just about Russia. The Middle East offers a grim reflection. Iran, like Russia, has faced systematic provocation, covert assassinations, drone raids, and open threats. Yet, unlike Moscow, Tehran's responses have often been cautious, symbolic, and ineffective. What does this reveal about modern warfare, deterrence, and survival in a multipolar world? And why did Scott Ritter warn, you can't deter what you don't understand? Stay with us. What you're about to hear may change how you see the next global war. Let us go back to April of the year 2022. While Western media projected images of a Russian retreat from Kyiv, the reality was something different, an act of diplomatic goodwill. Russia withdrew its forces not because of battlefield losses, but in the hopes of fostering negotiations during the Istanbul peace talks. It was a political message that Moscow was willing to de-escalate if Washington and its allies responded in kind, but they didn't. Instead of negotiation came escalation. According to the Times, Western analysts privately acknowledged that the withdrawal gave Ukraine a strategic opening, and they took it. Fast forward to April of the year 2025, history repeated itself. Moscow again signaled readiness for diplomacy. For 30 days, it unilaterally stopped striking Ukrainian energy infrastructure. This wasn't announced with fireworks, but with strategic silence. Yet the response from the other side was not diplomacy. According to a joint report by Russian defense media and international observers, over 3,000 unmanned aerial vehicles were launched against Russian energy communication and military infrastructure during that ceasefire window. These weren't makeshift drones. These were coordinated multi-wave assaults, likely supported by NATO reconnaissance and communications. On May 31st, over 100 Russian civilians were killed or wounded in attacks, blamed on Ukrainian sabotage teams operating near Belgorod and Kursk. One day later on June, first Ukraine launched 117 UAVs deep into Russian territory. The target's strategic bombers, the distance over 4,000 kilometers from Ukraine's border. The result, at least 10 Tuesday 95 and Tuesday 22 M3 aircraft were reported destroyed at multiple Russian air bases. Some intelligence reports cited by Kommersant and Izvestia claimed the total damage reached 41 aircraft either destroyed or disabled. This was not a miscalculation. It was a doctrine, one perfected over time: provoke a ceasefire, use it to redeploy and gather intelligence, then strike deep with drones or long-range assets. The same strategy was employed by Israel just days before nuclear talks with Iran in late 2023. Israeli drones struck critical Iranian radar sites and enrichment facilities, crippling Iran's bargaining position before it even reached the table. Goodwill, once a diplomatic tool, has now become a liability in the age of unmanned war. Restraint is not rewarded, it's exploited. As history repeats itself with increasing precision, we must ask, who exactly is writing the playbook? Two different regions, two different enemy, but one identical method. Within just 2 weeks, the same strategy was executed across two conflict zones, one in Eastern Europe, the other in the Middle East. In Ukraine, drone warfare has become a daily affair, but this time in early June of the year 2025, the Ukrainian military launched a coordinated drone offensive deep inside Russia. Simultaneously, Israel carried out a precision airstrike on Iran's underground nuclear facilities near Fordo and Isfahan. Both attacks occurred just before sensitive diplomatic meetings Ukraine and Russia over ceasefire negotiations in Istanbul and the United States, and Iran over the nuclear accord revival. According to reports from Al Mayadeen and the Jerusalem Post, the strikes were not coincidental. Both were prepared weeks in advance, both involved unmanned or covert delivery methods, and both were carried out in a narrow time window before talks. The tactical logic was simple but devastating: destroy high-value assets before they become bargaining chips, cripple deterrence, then dictate the peace. The pattern is disturbingly clear. In April of the year 2024, Israeli forces assassinated Iranian General Mohammad Reza Zahedi inside the Iranian consulate in Damascus. The message was loud and clear: no place is safe. In July, Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar was eliminated in Tehran while attending the inauguration of Iran's new president. 2 months later, in September, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah was killed in Beirut. In response, Iran launched over 200 ballistic missiles, but satellite imagery published by Reuters and defense blogs showed minimal structural damage. Why? Because Iran's retaliation, while dramatic, lacked surprise and penetration. According to analysts at Al Jazeera and The Times, most missiles were intercepted or misdirected. Iran's policy of publicly announcing its revenge days in advance had reduced it to spectacle, not strategy. But here's where the lesson turns sobering. Iran, like Russia, is under constant pressure. The difference is, in response, Tehran has often chosen caution, sometimes as a necessity, sometimes as an error. It doesn't lack courage, it lacks timing. As Scott Ritter famously warned, you can't bluff with a busted flush. And in this geopolitical poker game, Iran keeps revealing its hand too early. That said, it's unfair to demand that Iran behave like Israel or Russia. Its geostrategic position is fragile. It faces isolation, economic warfare, and proxy sabotage. But the lesson is clear: deterrence that is never demonstrated becomes irrelevant. And as Iran walks the tightrope between principle and paralysis, Russia has taken another path entirely. The most dangerous weapon in the West's arsenal isn't a cruise missile or a hypersonic warhead. It's narrative manipulation. It's the theater of innocence. Every time a new round of escalation occurs, whether drone strikes deep in Russian territory or assassinations of high-ranking officials in Tehran, The West scrambles to disassociate. We had no prior knowledge, says Washington. We're investigating murmurs. Berlin? But reality, like debris from a missile strike, has a way of landing close to home. Take Germany, for instance. In May of the year 2025, Chancellor Olaf Scholz stood before reporters and declared that Taurus long-range missiles would not be transferred to Ukraine. He emphasized parliamentary control, legal complications, and the need to avoid further escalation. Yet just weeks later, Der Spiegel published internal memos revealing that German technicians were assisting in the final assembly of Taurus systems inside Ukrainian territory. Not a direct transfer, perhaps, but certainly not a clean conscience either. Israel plays a similar game. According to the Jerusalem Post and statements by Israeli diplomats, Patriot systems were never formally transferred to Ukraine. Yet images verified by defense analysts showed those very systems deployed near key Ukrainian infrastructure, coincidentally, after Israeli military visits. The pattern here isn't unique. It's standard. Deniability is built into the pipeline. Supplies don't go from A to B. They go from A to C to B, passing through Eastern European intermediaries, private contractors, and non-state logistics hubs. And amid this smokescreen, Ukrainian drone attacks are becoming more surgical, more synchronized, and more devastating. NATO advisors, officially, trainers, unofficially commanders are increasingly present near front lines. Drone warfare stations are operating out of Polish and Romanian territory, targeting Russian assets under layers of indirect authorization. And when Russia retaliates, when a missile finds its way to a suspected NATO-linked logistics hub, the West clutches its pearls and gasps. How could they? As if the line between participation and provocation were still sacred, this pattern escalate by proxy, deny publicly, isn't just a tactic, it's doctrine. From the JCPOA negotiations with Iran to the Minsk Accords, the West has mastered the art of entangling conflict without committing openly. But that playbook, once useful, is now painfully transparent. But Russia is no longer surprised and no longer playing by Cold War etiquette. If Tehran plays defense on the chessboard of geopolitics, then Moscow plays strategy. While Iran's reactions have sometimes come too little too late, Russia has chosen another formula, entirely strategic patience with sharp edges. It does not respond with loud declarations or public threats. Instead, it allows time and precision to turn chaos into control. In recent months, Russian UAVs and cruise missiles have struck deeper into Ukraine, not merely at military positions, but at Western-funded intelligence centers, drone assembly depots, and covert logistics hubs. Facilities in Kharkiv, Lviv, and even Western Ukrainian border zones, believed to be staging grounds for foreign equipment, have come under calculated bombardment. These aren't acts of rage, they are carefully orchestrated disruptions. The message attrition is more powerful than headlines. Moscow is grinding down Ukrainian capability while indirectly draining Western coffers. As confirmed by the Financial Times, NATO countries are increasingly facing domestic pressure due to military budget expansion and weapons stock depletion. Meanwhile, Russia's military-industrial base has shifted to wartime rhythm, long-term, high-volume, and self-sufficient. The West sees Moscow's silence as weakness, but it may be its greatest weapon, because behind that silence are red lines, and Russia has defined them with chilling clarity. First, Ukraine will not join NATO. That line has been held violently but decisively. Second, foreign troops operating inside Ukraine will be treated as combatants. French, German, and Polish personnel have already faced drone attacks in recent weeks. Third, if Russia perceives an existential threat, it reserves the right to respond with all means necessary, including nuclear force. According to RIA Novosti, high-level officials close to the Kremlin have reiterated that these lines are not rhetorical, they are strategic. And while Iran often struggles with fragmented leadership, Moscow has maintained operational unity from its diplomatic channels to its military hierarchy. Why the difference? Because for Russia, this is not merely about Ukraine, this is about reshaping global balance. It is about proving that NATO's model of encroachment is not universal. It is about sending a message to Washington, Brussels, and beyond. The post-Cold War order is not eternal. As Scott Ritter once said, Russia doesn't need to win quickly. It just needs to not lose. Time is a weapon too. And right now, Russia is wielding that weapon masterfully. So if the West keeps pretending this is a low-stakes match, it may soon learn just how wrong it is. There's a growing claim among critics in the West and even a few voices inside Russia that Moscow is too restrained, that its red lines are written in chalk, not steel. That while NATO, Ukraine, and their allies test those lines with increasing boldness, Russia simply watches, waits, and writes another statement. But this claim misses a vital truth. Russia is not Israel, and Russia is not Iran. Israel's doctrine is clear deterrence through dominance. When it senses existential threat, it hits first, asks later, and apologizes never. In April 2024, when Iranian General Mohammad Reza Zahedi was assassinated in Damascus inside a consulate, Israel didn't flinch. It calculated. In July, when Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar was killed in Tehran, there were no claims of responsibility, just satisfaction. In September, when Hezbollah's leader met a similar fate in Beirut, the cycle completed itself. Iran responded with over 200 ballistic missiles, yet satellite imagery reviewed by the Times of London revealed minimal damage, symbolic rage, not strategic reprisal. Iran has often chosen caution over confrontation. Surrounded by sanctions, isolated diplomatically, Tehran fears the one mistake that might justify full Western intervention. But this restraint, admirable in some eyes, has cost Iran heavily. The West, and especially Israel, has interpreted it not as wisdom, but as weakness. As Scott Ritter once put it, if you leave your flank open long enough, someone will drive a tank through it. And for Tehran, too many flanks have been left unguarded for too long. Russia sees both models and refuses to adopt either in full. It has the destructive capacity of Israel, but not its demographic fragility. It shares Iran's strategic depth, but not its indecisiveness. And most importantly, Moscow understands that reaction alone is not strategy. Russia doesn't lash out. It recalibrates. It doesn't retaliate emotionally. It responds systemically. This is why its strikes aren't always immediate, but they are increasingly precise. It's why it targets infrastructure, logistics, and command hubs rather than empty symbols. It's why it invests in long-term attrition instead of dramatic short-term revenge. And it's why the Kremlin isn't seeking applause, it's seeking endurance. Tehran too is beginning to adapt. The assassinations of key military leaders and nuclear scientists have shaken the regime, but now reports from Mer News and IRNA suggest Iran is accelerating UAV development, coordinating more closely with Russia, and preparing to shift from reactive defense to proactive deterrence. It's not enough yet, but it's a start. Russia has learned this the hard way. In a world shaped by proxy wars and blurred fronts, survival doesn't belong to the loudest, it belongs to the most adaptable. This isn't about theatrics, it's about results. And while Iran is still learning, Russia is already applying, because in this war of attrition, the real weapon is adaptation. This is not a war over borders, it's a war over rules, a war over who gets to set them. Russia is not lashing out, it is reshaping the board. Iran's caution has cost it dearly. Israel's aggression keeps it on edge. But Russia, it's playing the long game with the endurance of an empire and the memory of betrayal. As Scott Ritter once said, Russia doesn't fight for territory, it fights to be heard. And now finally the world is listening. Do you think Russia's strategy is working, or should they hit harder like Israel? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Because geopolitics is no longer a spectator sport.